Okay, here we are in week 6 looking at social construction of reality. So we're going to look at in terms of, the social structure and social behavior. How do we sort of structure the reality around us? And then the role and importance of nonverbal communication in helping us construct this understanding of the world around us. Then we're going to look at what is collective behavior. And in particular, we'll look at crowds and masses, the different types of crowds and masses, and the role that they play in our society and in our own growth and development. You could even say within our own sort of socialization, how we gain a sense of who we are as a people. And then lastly, we're going to look at social movements. How do social movements as a collective shape and or influence society? Okay, so I hope this is going to be good for you. Please feel free to be asking questions using via email or stop me in the hallway. I wander around a fair bit, making myself available for people to see where I am and to be able to answer any questions that I can. All right, so good luck and carry on. Okay, what we're going to be looking at, just as a reminder, we're looking at social interactions among individuals, and we're going to really focus on the face-to-face encounters. We're also going to look at the social construction of reality, and in particular with focus on some of the nonverbal communication features of how we interact. So when we look at social construction of reality, the process by which our perception of reality is shaped largely by the subjective meaning that we give to an experience. Now, it's an emphasis to process, and it's perception, so each of us looking at the same event will see something a little bit different based on our own subjective meaning associated with it, based on we all have a personal background and all of that individuality in terms of how we become who we are and influence of our family and whatever we choose to watch, read, and influence us influences our perception. And so the construction of social reality, or the social construction of reality, is a very personal thing, and it's the meaning that we give the experiences that we have. Now, in theory, we act on this reality as we see it, and not necessarily as it is. The definition of the situation, that is to say. So, even though we're at an intersection, what I see and what you see could in fact be interpreted differently. Not so dramatically different that we don't know we're at an intersection, but what we witness and what we paid attention to would be different. But our social construction of reality allows us to interact on a daily basis without a lot of error. I know when I go into Tim Hortons and I order a coffee, I'm going to get a coffee and they're going to ask for money, and it's going to be the amount of money on a consistent basis. And so there's a social awareness of how that gets played out and the rules of it. So a definition of a situation, we analyze the social context in which we find ourselves. We determine what is in our best interest, and we adjust our attitude and actions according to that situation. Now, there's a thing that we call self-fulfilling prophecies. And this is the false belief or prediction that produces behavior that makes the original false belief come true. For example, if I'm told repeatedly that I'm not a good person, then I may begin to believe I'm not a good person. So when we look at social construction of reality and we look at homelessness in families, you might ask yourself, so what role does my family play, and what kind of family do I have? Do I have an intact family with mom and dad and siblings? Has my experience been influenced by living in a single-parented family or a same-sex family? All of those family differences will shape some of how I see the social construction of reality of where I live. The same with homelessness. Do I walk past somebody without giving them a second glance? Do I reach out and help and see if I can't be of some help? How do I see the world around me? How do I respond to the situations and life experiences that I meet up with on an everyday basis? So when we think about the interaction that we have with people over the course of a day, and all the different people that we know very well and people we may not know as well, strangers even, we can look at nonverbal communication. The functions of nonverbal communication are wide and varied. Nonverbal communication can supplement verbal
So as I use my tone of voice and the cadence in my voice, I can use that nonverbal component, the cadence, the speed in which I speak, the rate or the intonation, the up and down motions of my voice can all be nonverbal communications to emphasize or supplement what I'm doing and what I'm trying to communicate verbally. Nonverbal communication can regulate social interactions. I don't have to say to my daughter when she's a child to keep her voice down. I can put my finger to my mouth and make it appear as if I'm just asking her to be quiet. So it regulates social interactions. If someone's talking to me and I don't really want to pay attention, I can just turn my back to them. That's nonverbal, and it regulates social interaction. Nonverbal can establish power in relationships. Because I'm a taller person, I can express a certain degree of power over somebody by standing very close to them and sort of making them feel intimidated. Now, we can use all sorts of different methods in which we can use nonverbal communication to communicate a lot about ourselves. Now, there is what we call deference. Deference is the symbolic means in which subordinates give a response to those in power. Now, for example, if you arrive at your job and you're just fairly new at your job and you meet the boss, chances are you're going to act in somewhat of a deferent way. That is to say, you're not going to tell the boss what to do. You're not going to behave with the boss that you would with someone who you're close with and are on the same level with. You're going to pay some respect to that boss by virtue of the role and the status that they have. And that's called deference. Now, in nonverbal communication, one of the big elements is facial expression. Smiles, eye contact, even staring, eyebrow movements, all of these facial expressions reflect gender-based patterns of dominance and subordination. Women are more likely to sustain eye contact during conversations than are men. No direct eye contact from subordinates to those in power. This reflects rank. Now, we use facial expressions constantly, and in fact, there are times when we get mixed messages from one another because the nonverbal facial expressions don't seem to match the words that come out of our mouth. And so some of our misunderstandings and even miscommunications occur out of not getting our verbal and nonverbal communication in sync. Now, when we look at other forms of non-communication and the way that we communicate with one another, we can look also at touching. Touching is a very important non-communication technique and strategy, and there's very wide varieties of way in which we express meaning through intimacy, through touching. We can express intimacy with touching. We can express friendships, sexual connotations. There is all sorts of meaning. We can provide support. We can demonstrate authority or power. We can make people feel uncomfortable. Gender differences can have an influence on the way things get communicated, and so can who touches first may reflect rank, and who touches over who doesn't touch can reflect authority and or power. And so much can communicate. I mean, just even for example, if you're standing at a bus stop and I were to approach you and inquire, what time is it? What time does the bus arrive? And I put my hand on your shoulder nearest to me. That would give you one sense of touch. That would give you one degree of sensitivity to, oh, I'm being touched. However, if I approached you and instead of touching your near shoulder, I reached around your back and touched your other shoulder, that might give you a different response to my question about time. Now, what I did there was cross your midline, your spine. Your spine is like the midline of your body. And touches that occur, by strangers at least, that are near to you, don't crossing your midline, give you a different response non-verbally than if that touch comes from crossing your midline. Now, in relationship to touch and connected to some in a way, is what we call the personal space. There's an intimate space and public space, and you know when it's been breached because you feel uncomfortable. Personal space is an immediate area surrounding you that a person claims as private. Now, intimate space would be contact within less than about a half a meter. And this is limited to certain people in our lives who we have a higher degree of trust and relationship with. Public space, on the other hand, is often considered to be over 3.6 meters, which is quite significant. It's more formal, it makes impersonal speech nearly impossible. Now, the theme here is that when others invade our space, we may retreat, stand our ground, become angry, become uncomfortable. And so that bubble, if you will, that space bubble that we carry around us, might vary from person to person as to what degree that is, but there is typically a barrier, a line, a invisible marker that sort of says, you've crossed into my personal space. Anything outside of my personal space, I have a certain degree of comfort with you. Okay, now there's a lot more to nonverbal communication than just that. But we're only going to be limiting ourselves just to these parts because I want to move on to what is known as collective behavior. And so when we look at social structure and social interaction among people, we look at a lot of the nonverbal communication, but what we want to look at next is collective behavior. So let's have a peek. Collective behavior by definition is the voluntary and often spontaneous activity that engages a large number of people and typically violates the dominant group's norms and values. Okay, it's spontaneous often, it's voluntary, and it involves a large number of people that typically would, in that instance, violate the larger group's norms and values. Okay. So some of the elements is that it lacks official division of labor. It's not an organization. That's why I would say it lacks an official division of labor. It doesn't have hierarchy of authority. There's not a leader among all and then sort of sub-leaders and managers, if you will. And there are established rules and there aren't established rules and procedures. Oftentimes when people form collectives, they're spontaneous. So there's not a lot of time to organize them. Social protests regarding social problems. If you remember the G20 and the 1% social protests, these would be considered examples of collectives. They're spontaneous a lot of times. They are voluntary, that is, you choose to go. There isn't a lot of organization to it. But what we're going to do now is sort of look at some of the conditions by which collective behavior does occur. Because there are circumstances in which collectives work and others where they don't work so well. So when we look at the G20 in Toronto, it's an example that meets one of the criteria for collectives. So collective behavior occurs as a result of some common influences or stimuli that produces a response from the collectivity. A large number of people who mutually transcend or bypass or subvert the established institutional patterns and structures. Now there's three factors that can contribute to the likelihood that a collective behavior will occur. So if you remember the G20 as an example, one of the reasons that it occurred there is that was the place where there was economic focus. And so people came with economic issues, affordable housing, adequate income. And so there wasn't just one group of social protesters, there were many groups with a similar focus because that was the opportunity that it presented itself. So the first is there are structural factors that increase the chance of people responding in a particular way. There's a stage setting. And so in this case of the G20, it was the economic variables. The second is about timing. Most of these collectives will occur on weekends and evenings. Now there's a reason for that. It's not just because that's when, it's the most convenient. One, people who are working are more able to voluntarily participate in the evenings and on weekends. The other reason is that police forces aren't as well staffed on weekends and evenings, so there's a greater likelihood that the collective can have a voice. And then thirdly is that there's typically a breakdown in social control mechanisms corresponding with normlessness. That is, this lack of lack of security policing on these times. And so this is what makes collectives more likely to work. Now, people may engage in collective behavior when they find that their problems are not being solved through official channels. A lot of the people who protested at the G20 would have been trying other means by which to get change to happen, but didn't feel as if they were being paid attention to in the channels that they were asked to do. So when the problem appears to grow worse, or when the situation is conducive, when communication is both quick and easy, and people's attitudes are not always reflected in their political or social behavior. So many people talk about the importance of climate change or homelessness, but they don't vote or don't vote for candidates with supportive platforms. So people act collectively to make a statement and to make things known to other people. Now, we can look also within collectives to look at crowds. There's different types of crowds. Crowds are relatively large number of people who are in one or another's immediate vicinity. And you'll see there's a variety of different types of crowds, and these would fit within collective behavior as well. So we have casual and conventional crowds. The casual crowd is that large crowd who happens to be in one place at the same time. Now this could you may find yourself having been a part of a casual crowd as opposed to a conventional crowd. This is who come together for a scheduled event. So if you go to a hockey game and there's a lot of people in the parking lot after the game, you're a part of a conventional crowd. Whereas a casual crowd would be a group of people who find themselves in one place at the same time, happenstancely. Maybe you've gone to a park and there's a lot of people at the park. That would be considered a casual crowd. Now there is also expressive and acting crowds. Expressive crowds come together and express a strong emotion. Again, this would be an example perhaps of the G20. You may also find not only expressive but acting crowds. These are intense and violent. Now there's subcategories of these. A mob is a highly emotional crowd who are violent against a person or a group or a place. Now you saw some examples of mob behavior at the G20. Now a riot is a violent crowd with no particular target. Now if you remember when Vancouver lost the Stanley Cup, there was a large, if we will, a riot that occurred in downtown Vancouver, and there wasn't a specific person or group that was targeted, but a lot of people went about creating a havoc by burning police cars and throwing stones and rocks at stores and buildings. And then lastly, in this acting crowd is panic, when people act or react to a real or perceived threat. Someone yells out fire when they're at a movie theater and everybody runs out in a panic. There was, I think it was at the recent, a religious event where there was stampedes of people. There were millions of people in the street and several hundred people were killed as a result of the stampede. It's not exactly panic, although when people started to move quickly, it created a state of panic, and that's what had a big impact on the loss of life. And then lastly, as a type of crowd, there are protest crowds, and these groups, or these crowds, engage in activities intended to achieve a specific goal. These crowds typically aren't violent as much as they are participating in civil disobedience. Now, in contrast to crowds are mass behavior. And mass behavior is sort of, well, by difference, the difference between a riot, that's a proximity issue, that would be a crowd, and a rumor where proximity is not an issue. So collective behavior that takes place when people, who often are geographically separated, and respond to the same event in much the same way. That's a mass. Okay, they're not this time in the vicinity, If you're in the vicinity, you're a crowd. If you're not within the vicinity of one another, you're a mass. And there are several types. Rumors. You don't need to be in the same place at the same time to spread a rumor. It's unsubstantiated reports on an issue or on a subject or about a person. But rumors, you don't need to be in the same place. Whereas gossip, these are rumors about a person's personal life of individuals. And probably we've all been a part of contributing to rumors and gossip and haven't been a recipient of the target of the rumor or gossip. Now, mass hysteria and panic when a large group of individual people react with strong emotion or self-destructive behavior to perceived or real threat. And then lastly are fads and fashions, and we've all probably participated in different examples of fads and fashions. A fad is a temporary but widely copied activity, enthusiastically followed by large numbers of people. Back in my day, it was things like pet rocks, Florida sunshine in a can. These were fads. They didn't last forever, but they were fun while they were there. Now, lastly, what we'll look at is social movements. Now, social movements, these are collective behaviors that are not usually sustained, but social movements are organized groups that act consciously to promote or resist change through collective action. Now, more sustainable, these like social movements tend to be more sustainable. If you think of a social movement like even the feminists, that's a social movement looking at making some change to promote or resist change through a collective action. They're very sustainable. They've been around for a very long time. They're goal-oriented. They have a specific goal and purpose about being a social movement, and they're organized. They're not like collective behaviors which are more spontaneous. These are organized, well thought out, goal-oriented. Okay, they rely a lot on volunteers. They help excluded groups get more into the political process. So you find that you have the clean water, clean air, climate change, the 1%, looking at transgender and gay rights. These are all possible examples of social movements. Now, not every social movement operates on a similar theme. There's different forms of social movements. You can have reform or revolutionary. The reform movements that are movements that seek to improve society and work within existing structures. The labor movement, for example, animal rights groups, anti-smoking groups, these are all groups that use existing structures, government lobby groups, using educational programs as a way of communicating and spreading their message. Now, revolutionary groups, they don't work within the existing structures. They want to replace existing systems. Terrorism is a calculated, unlawful use of physical force or threats of violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, organization, or individuals for the purpose of gaining some political, religious, economic, or social objective. So the difference between reform and revolutionary, reform will work within existing systems. Revolutionary does not work within existing systems. Now, that is not the only limit to social movements, and we'll look at religious. These are the focuses that are about conversions. They're about interchange focus. They're not about group focus as much as you as an individual. And so you'll find examples, lots of examples of religious social movements of varying kinds. Now, you'll also see alternative social movements. So these seek to limit change in some aspects of people's lives. Vegetarianism, New Age spirituality, the Women's Temperance, Christian Temperance Union from the early 1900s. Its focus was around trying to prevent the use of alcohol and to lobby against the death penalty. So these were alternatives to seek change in some aspect of people's lives or in society. And then lastly is the resistance social movement, and they seek to prevent change. For example, the pro-life program, protecting the rights of the unborn child. And so when we look at, these examples of collectives, these are all parts of society, these are all parts of the social structure and way in which groups of people contribute to and participate in a particular society. Okay, I hope this is going well for you. We are drawing near to the end. We're into week 7 here. So actually at the end of the week, it's reading week. So please don't show up to school. You'll be the only one here. All right now, enjoy your reading week. Have a good break and we'll see you back in week 8. Bye now.